Hi guys, this is one of our tutorials that's in our online textbook, and some of these are really great just when you're first learning and studying something and you need to just learn them, practice them, review them before you start applying them in your own reading and writing. So this tutorial will focus on elements of poetry. There's often a voice that will narrate for you, and then I'll just kind of chime in with some extra stuff here and there.
When you hear the word poetry, do you think of flowery words and sing-song rhymes? Do you think of your favorite songs? Poetry is a type of literature in which words are chosen and arranged in specific ways to create an effect. Poems come in many different types, styles, and forms. Some poems tell stories, while others express emotions or paint pictures in words.
So this is kind of the fun difference between the prose that we've read in our cultural novels, which is just narrative fiction, and poetry. Um, Poetry has a lot less words, so words have to be very carefully chosen and arranged so that the reader can kind of have that picture painted in their mind.
Just as a story has a narrator, a poem has a speaker, the voice that talks to the reader. It's important to remember that the speaker and the poet are not necessarily the same. Who is the speaker in this example?
The teacher's face falls. Wrong answer. A slow burn creeps, turning pink and red, crawling up my neck, fanning out over my cheeks. I look down and pretend to study the name carved into my desk. So in this example, we have to think, what is the speaker doing? Based on these actions of feeling really embarrassed and starting to have their face turn red, that's typically not a teacher, that is a student.
Form refers to the way a poem is laid out on the page. Unlike prose, in which sentences follow one after another in paragraphs, poetry is divided into lines and stanzas. Stanzas are groups of lines. The place where a line ends is called a line break. The end of a line of poetry does not always signal the end of a sentence or thought. Often, poets will continue a sentence or thought across several lines. Click the image to analyze the form of a poem. Ask yourself, how many lines and stanzas does this poem have? Where does each thought begin and end? It was July, and the sun toasted the emerald grass until it smelled of warmth and green and life. It was July, and my heart soaked up the airy warmth until it sang of joy and love and life.
So lines are very simple. They start, and then where they end, that is the line. Right here after sun is a line break. Here's your second line, third, fourth. You have a big space here, so that also is your hint that that's the end of the stanza, the group of lines. So in this one, we have 4 lines in one stanza. We have a second stanza of 4 lines.
One thing you will notice about poetry is that it comes in all kinds of different forms. Some poems follow strict rules about lines, stanzas, rhythm, and rhyme. These are called traditional poems. Some traditional types of poetry you might know are ballads, sonnets, and limericks. Other poems have no recognizable patterns or rules. Their lines do not rhyme in any regular way, and might not even be similar lengths. These poems are called free verse poems.
Free verse poems are the kind that we are going to focus on in this unit. I feel like traditional poems are the kinds that you studied most often in elementary school.
Traditional or conventional poems follow rules for lines,
So we're going to skip this because we're not working on it.
While traditional poems follow rules, free verse poems break them.
Okay, so this slide is telling you about free verse poetry and how it doesn't really follow the rules of line breaks and stanzas and rhyme. And often it just sounds like everyday speech. The big difference is, of course, smaller lines. You're not going to have a page filled with words like a chapter book page. The other difference is fewer words that are much more carefully chosen to give you the right imagery. So let's go to our next slide. Nope. Okay, so this slide is talking to you about sound devices. And for our sake of our unit, we're going to be calling them figurative language, and we're really just focusing on these two, onomatopoeia and alliteration. There'll be another slide that talks about 4 other types that we'll get to. So onomatopoeia is the use of words whose sound echo their meanings. You've probably seen this a lot in graphic novels and comic books. Common examples are the words buzz, gargle, hiss, thump. You can find onomatopoeia in many kinds of writing, like the graphic novels and comics I just mentioned. It's used to vividly describe certain sounds so that a reader can hear the words of the page. And the other type we're going to talk about and practice identifying is alliteration. Alliteration is the repetition of consonant sounds at the beginning of 2 or more nearby words. One little trick I have to remember what alliteration means is I look at the actual word. The second and third letters are both L. L's are consonants, and these are next to each other, so they're repeated. So that helps me remember that its alliteration is the repetition of consonant sounds. This type of sound device or figurative language can help make a poem memorable or create a certain mood or feeling. When you were in elementary school, if you had studied alliteration, you probably studied it in kind of silly little songs and tongue twisters. And that's a little bit of what this example is. A litter of playful, pretty puppies pranced in the grass. Alliteration often doesn't have that obvious heavy amount of repetition. It'll be much more subtle. We're going to skip rhythm and meter. We don't need to be quizzed over that. Moving on. We're going to talk about word choice and imagery. That will be in a different lesson. Figurative language. These are the other 4 types that we are going to practice learning and identifying. Simile. Some of you, this is kind of a more common one if you've learned any poetry in the past. A simile is a comparison between 2 unlike things using like or as. The example here is the singer purred like a kitten as she sang the old love song. This example uses both like and as to compare a singer to a kitten. But a simile doesn't have to use both. It could have just said the singer purred like a kitten when she sang. A metaphor is similar in that it still compares to unlike things. However, it does not use the words like or as. He never forgot a thing. His mind was a steel trap. Metaphors can be hard to identify because it just says his mind was a steel trap. Well, nobody's mind really is. This writer is comparing a person's mind to a steel trap because both are quick and sharp. And it did not use like or as, so that makes it a metaphor. Another type of figurative language we're going to focus on is personification. Personification gives human traits to something that is non-human. And the way I remember it is the word person starts this word. Person and human, synonyms. They mean the same thing. So I think to myself, if something acts like a person but is not a person, it's personification. So the example they have, the ocean tossed us around without mercy. An ocean really can't toss you around. A person can, and that's why they're personifying the ocean. The last type of figurative language we're going to focus on in this unit, here they're saying exaggeration, but this is the word we use. We're going to be calling it a hyperbole. It looks like hyperbole, but it's pronounced hyperbole. A hyperbole is an exaggeration or an overstatement used to emphasize a point or can create humor as well. So the example says, that flight was 1,000 hours long. It wasn't really 1,000 hours, but it felt so long you really wanted to prove your point. Okay, so now we've got some practice between simile and metaphor. Says, read each sample poem and select the type of figurative language being used. So in this first example, in this lonely street, I am a tumbleweed, bouncing from nowhere to nowhere. So if you remember, a simile uses like or as. And as I look at this statement, I don't see the word like and I don't see the word as. I just see that someone is comparing the way they walk around to being a tumbleweed. So that is a metaphor. Looking at this example, we need to identify if it's personification or a hyperbole. The clouds jog across the sky, chasing playfully after one another. Clouds really can't jog and play and chase, but a person can. So this is personification. So here's a little summary of a few things that we learned. If you remember that poetry is still a type of literature, it's most often fiction, but the big difference is that words are chosen and arranged in specific ways to create an effect. Instead of sentences and paragraphs, poems are made up of lines and stanzas. And we are going to the second paragraph. Basically what you need to know from that summary is that we're not going to be focused on traditional poetry. We're going to be really reading and analyzing free verse poetry. And one of the things we're going to do when we analyze and read poetry is we are going to work on identifying figurative language, specifically alliteration, onomatopoeia, simile, metaphor, personification, and hyperbole.